Hello, welcome to video lecture number 82. Today we are looking at life on the home front. For our subsections today we have for the duration, migration and the wartime city, and finally Japanese removal. So life on the home front for Americans involved neither heavy civilian casualties or widespread property destruction as it did for other citizens in warring nations. For Americans with loved ones in the armed forces, there was fear. Fear for those losing loved ones in the war and grief. But rationing and wartime shortages of consumer products were inconveniences, rarely hardships in a nation experiencing war-based prosperity. Publicized drives to secure blood, collect scrap metal, sell government bonds, and plant victory gardens contributed to the war effort and reminded those on the home front that American soldiers were fighting and dying in a war. In describing life in the U.S. during World War II, the text makes clear that Japanese Americans, most of them American-born citizens, suffered as no other group did during the war here, or during World War I, for that matter, for all its intolerance and repression. So let's have a closer look then at life on the home front with our first subsection, which is for the duration. People on the home front worked on civilian defense committees, collected old newspapers and scrap material, served on local rationing and draft boards, and planted victory gardens that produced 40% of the nation's vegetables. The Office of War Information, the OWI, strove to disseminate information and promote patriotism. The OWI urged advertising agencies to link their clients' products to the war effort. Popular culture also reflected America's new international involvement and built morale on the home front. For example, many movies had patriotic themes, demonstrated heroism of ordinary citizens, or warned of the dangers of fascism, while newsreels and on-the-spot radio broadcasts kept the public up to date on the war. Perhaps the greatest source of Americans' high morale was wartime prosperity, as federal defense spending had ended the Depression. Workers earned higher take-home pay, despite wage freezes, than at any point since the 1920s. Now, the major inconveniences of the war then were the limitations that were placed on consumption. Almost everything Americans ate, wore, or used during the war was subjected to rationing or regulation by the Office of Price Administration. So let's go to the next section then, which is migration and the wartime city. The war also affected where people lived. Families followed service members to training bases or points of debarkation, and the lure of high-paying defense jobs encouraged others to move. As a center of defense production, California was affected by the wartime migration more than any other state. California experienced a 53% growth in their population, as more than 1 million African Americans migrated to defense centers in California, Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Racial conflicts arose in these places over jobs and housing. In Los Angeles, male Latinos who belonged to Pachuco gangs or youth gangs dressed in what were called zoot suits. Blacks and some working-class white teenagers also wore zoot suits as a symbol of alienation and self-assertion, but to adults and Anglos, the attire symbolized wartime juvenile delinquency. In Los Angeles, zoot suiters became the target of white hostility toward Mexican Americans, and also military hostility, because a lot of the white military service members stationed in Los Angeles at the time experienced several conflicts with young Mexican Americans. In July 1943, rumors that a Pachuco gang had beaten a white sailor set off a riot that lasted for 4 days. All right, let's go to the last section then, which is Japanese removal. Despite some racial tension, the home front was generally calm in the 1940s. Germans and Italian Americans usually did not experience intense prejudice, although the prejudice was there. And leftists and communists faced little repression after the Soviet Union became one of our allies. Now, the internment of Japanese Americans, however, on the West Coast was a glaring exception to racial tolerance, a reminder of the fragility of civil liberty in wartime. In early 1942, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which gave the War Department the authority to evacuate Japanese Americans from the West Coast and interned them in relocation camps for the rest of the war. Despite the lack of any evidence of disloyalty or sedition, few public figures came out and opposed the plan. The War Relocation Authority then rounded up 112,000 Japanese Americans, two-thirds of whom were citizens, and sent them to internment camps in California, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, and Arkansas. The Japanese Americans, who made up one-third of the population of Hawaii, though, were not interned. The Hawaiian economy would not have been able to function without them. There were exceptions. Furloughs for seasonal workers, attendance at college, and enlistment in the armed services were some routes out of the internment camps. Now, there was a man named Gordon Hirabayashi, who was among the few Japanese Americans who actively resisted incarceration. A student at the University of Washington, Hirabayashi was a religious pacifist who had registered with his draft board as a conscientious objector. He challenged internment by refusing to register for evacuation. Instead, he turned himself in to the FBI. He was tried and convicted in 1942. He appealed his case to the Supreme Court in Hirabayashi versus United States, 1943. In that case, and also in Korematsu versus United States, 1944, the court allowed the removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast on the basis of military necessity. But the court avoided the ruling on the constitutionality of the internment program. Congress issued, finally, a public apology in 1988 and awarded $20,000 to each of the 80,000 surviving Japanese American internees in the forms of reparations payments. Okay, so that's it for today. This is Life on the Home Front. Just a brief look at what the nation was like during the war. So go ahead and answer your review questions and continue on with your work.